The Las Vegas Raiders are in one of the most unique situations of any team this offseason. The Raiders clearly feel somewhat confident in their roster, and they're entering their second season with Josh McDaniels. But there are just so many question marks, and the biggest one is at quarterback. Derek Carr is gone, and the Raiders have a new quarterback in Jimmy Garoppolo. But there's still certainly a chance Las Vegas looks towards the draft, and that's what makes the Raiders so interesting right now. I think it's safe to say at this point that Josh McDaniels definitely disappointed in his first year as the Raiders head coach.
They do this every year.
Vegas started the season 2-7 and just looked horrible, and ultimately finished the season 6-11. It's not like they were getting killed either. 9 of those 11 losses were within one possession. They were actually the first team in NFL history to lose 5 games while leading by double digits in the second half. It was a disaster. When you lose that many games, especially in that way, you often expect that to be a coaching problem. The Raiders went all out before the season even started, trading for Davante Adams to pair him with Derek Carr. The Raiders already had Hunter Renfrow and Darren Waller, but things never really worked out, and the injuries certainly didn't help. Now, I definitely think the Raiders were a complete mess last year, but maybe they weren't as bad as people made it out to be. I don't think Carr was any worse than he had been in recent seasons, and Davante Adams was great, and so was Josh Jacobs. If Hunter Renfrow and Darren Waller could have actually stayed healthy, it's hard to really know what the season actually looked like. But the bad year made one thing very clear. Things needed to change. The Raiders are going to look very different next season after releasing Derek Carr. He was a team starter for 9 years, and that left Vegas with a giant hole at quarterback that's going to be filled by Jimmy Garoppolo. The Raiders gave him a 3-year, $67.5 million contract. Luckily for the Raiders, Garoppolo already has a lot of familiarity with second-year head coach Josh McDaniels, who was the offensive coordinator for the Patriots when Garoppolo was in New England. Garoppolo is coming off of 4 seasons in San Francisco, where he had a lot of success at times. That being said, he probably isn't the long-term guy in Las Vegas, and the Raiders know that. It was definitely time to move on from Carr, but it doesn't mean a vet is the right answer either. That gives the Raiders the option to take a quarterback at the draft. Now, that's a very tough decision, and I think it could really go either way, but I'm not fully buying it either. For one, it sounds like the top 4 quarterbacks are going to go early, so there's still a chance that the Raiders don't even have a chance to go after those guys. Surely Las Vegas won't get a sniff at Bryce Young, so the question really is if CJ Stroud, Anthony Richardson, or Will Levis can fall to them. Even then, the Raiders may not love all of those guys. It's really a tough decision, but I think the Raiders are in a good, secure spot after signing Jimmy Garoppolo. He's a true vet and will perform well if needed, but he can also be a good option to be the starter while another guy sits behind him and waits. But I wouldn't go betting on that quite yet. The Raiders hold the 7th overall pick at the draft, and that opens the doors up to a lot of options. Maybe Las Vegas could go quarterback, or one of those top defensive guys drops to them. Mel Kiper and Todd McShay both had the same pick at 7 for them. Cornerback Devin Witherspoon. He would be a day 1 starter for the Raiders, and Las Vegas could definitely use some help after being dead last in the league in takeaways last season. He's quick and smothers receivers well, and I think he'd honestly be a good fit in Las Vegas. Daniel Jeremiah actually mocked the Raiders to take edge rusher Tyree Wilson. Chandler Jones, simply put, just ended up being a huge flop last year, and getting a stud opposite of Max Crosby would be huge. Lance Zierlein took a very different approach. He actually had Will Levis going at 7, but that was after the Texans traded up to that spot. So that left the Raiders at 12 to select offensive tackle Darnell Wright. He was really impressive at the combine, and Las Vegas needs offensive line help. Kiper mocked the Raiders to use their 2nd-round pick on offensive guard Osiris Torrance, who allowed just 1 sack last season. I think the Raiders probably roll defense here in the 1st round. There are a lot of good pieces on offense, but that defense could use so much work. I think Tyree Wilson is a great pick, but with all the rumblings about Jalen Carter, if he falls down to 7, I'd expect the Raiders to immediately take him. The Raiders need a lot of help everywhere, and even a guy like Devin Witherspoon would be a huge help on that side of the ball. Las Vegas came into this offseason worried about defense, and honestly, that should be the focal point at the draft. The Raiders have already had a lot of changes this offseason, but one of the biggest moves was actually traded. Las Vegas sent Darren Waller to the Giants for a third-round pick. To combat that, the Raiders did sign Austin Hooper, who's coming off of a pretty disappointing season in Tennessee. The biggest signing for the Raiders, though, was probably Jacoby Myers. Just like Jimmy G, Myers has some past experience with head coach Josh McDaniels from his time in New England, so it kind of did make sense to ink him to a 3-year, $33 million deal after his success with the Patriots, including 3 straight years with 700+ yards. The big defensive acquisition could be Marcus Epps. He was a part of that dominant Eagles defense last season. He got a 2-year, $12 million deal to help that Raiders secondary that could really use any help it can get. Now, the Raiders didn't make any huge moves, but you could argue that they didn't really need to do a lot. I like the Marcus Epps signing a lot, and the Raiders did bring in some guys that will help complement that offense. The Raiders already have some pretty good pieces on that offense. Vegas placed the franchise tag on Josh Jacobs to keep him around after he led the league in rushing yards last year with 1,653. He's been good for the Raiders since being a first-round pick in 2019. The true star player on the Raiders offense, though, is absolutely Davante Adams. The Raiders traded a first and second to get him a year ago, and then made him the highest paid wide receiver in the league at the time. Of course, pairing him with Derek Carr, his college teammate at Fresno State, just didn't work. But Adams is still a beast and was great, with 1,500 yards and a league-leading 14 touchdowns. The guy coming out of the slot is Hunter Renfrow, and he's coming off of a very down season, but did have over 1,000 yards in 2021. Now, he's entering the second year of a 2-year, $32 million contract, so I'm sure he's looking to put up some pretty big numbers this next season. The Raiders' offensive line is actually pretty good, and the biggest reason for that is Colton Miller. He's turned into a really good left tackle. On the defense, Chandler Jones is still on the roster, despite having an underwhelming season last year. He only had 4.5 sacks last season, and 3 of those came in week 1. He's really been nothing but disappointing since that 3-year, $51 million contract, but don't forget just how good he was in Arizona with 60 sacks in 4 years. Chandler Jones probably still has some of that spark in him, and the Raiders really need him to turn things around. The Raiders definitely have the guys in that building, especially on offense. Last season, injuries and underperforming really hurt, and the reality is, Las Vegas should have had a way better record to begin with if they could simply close out games. That does make me worry about Josh McDaniels though, because if your team is able to compete closely week in and week out, but you're still losing, that's probably a coaching problem in my opinion. Now, it does have to be said that the Raiders are in a pretty tough spot in terms of division. The Chiefs are the kings of the AFC West, and really the entire league. Having to play them twice a year is pretty rough, but outside of the Chiefs, the Chargers are also a really good team with Justin Herbert behind center. The only real question mark team is the Broncos. Maybe Denver will be okay, or Russell Wilson will just get worse. I mean, who really knows? At the end of the day, the Raiders are a decent team with good pieces, but they're in a tough spot and have a big decision to make, because if Las Vegas doesn't have a top quarterback, it's going to be pretty hard to compete with the Patrick Mahomes and Justin Herberts of the league.